of us at the CSJ are so excited, I think it's fair to say, for today's discussion on the future of debt enforcement. And we'll hear very shortly from the Minister Lord Wolfson. Thank you for being here, Minister, as well as our brilliant panel, who I look forward to introducing shortly. But first I'm going to give an overview of the background to this, and I've got a few slides to help me out. I'm going to touch on the context, the coming together of the Enforcement Oversight working group, the proposal that group developed, and then I'll finish with some next steps. So one of the things that really frustrated me, to be honest, during the pandemic was the notion that it affected all of us evenly. You know, while some of us were able to make savings, you know, deprived of our commutes and holidays and flat whites and whatnot, this wasn't the case actually for many of those who were really struggling and already struggling before the pandemic began. And while the government certainly brought in very welcome protections, which I think it's fair to say averted what would have been a debt catastrophe, there does remain this mound of debt that's working its way through the system as we've reopened society. There's 3.3 million people in severe problem debt today, according to the charity Step Change. That's up 300,000 since the pandemic. We know that there's about £4.4 billion of outstanding council tax arrears, which is the primary source of problem debts that we hear about. But we also have a cost of living crisis underway. We're hearing about this more and more, and we know that this is likely to continue driving the situation and the grip of problem debt. But lest we forget, you know, many councils are frankly struggling too after what's been a difficult time. And all of this indicates, I think it's fair to say, that that enforcement will continue to play an increasingly prominent role in the ecosystem of debt collection. Now, while the caseload has certainly sort of fallen due to the pandemic and the backlog, and things are just starting to pick up, we saw an annual enforcement caseload of about 3.5 million cases in the year sort of running up to the pandemic, and we're expecting to see that starting to pick up again as that backlog is cleared. And all the while, it's fair to say that there have been several years of, you know, let's be honest, quite heated debate at times about the nature of bailiff reform and what needs to happen. And this has been brought out over the course of a number of official sort of calls for evidence and committee inquiries and discussions and campaigns. But you know, the thing that really struck me was when the pandemic sort of first reached the shores. There was a clear recognition, I think, from all sides that actually we needed to push the reset button and take a fresh look at this discussion. And more than that, actually roll our sleeves up and think, what can we do? And thus was born the Enforcement Oversight Working Group. So the working group was comprised of equal debt advice and enforcement representatives from across the sectors on both sides. And we really set out to address the key challenges identified in those years of discussion and debate. Things like the continued professionalisation of the sector, building on the important reforms that we saw in 2014, addressing the appearance of inconsistent and at times inadequate practice, looking at the messy complaint system as was identified by the Justice Committee in its inquiry report, but also the need to bring the whole sector up with the advances made in the sort of leaders within the industry, but also elsewhere in the treatment of vulnerable people. And in the process of let me tell you, quite intense negotiation, which I chaired for 7 months and probably lost several years of my life, the group worked together very, very closely to develop a proposal for a new industry-funded independent oversight body with a mandate to ensure fair treatment and protection for people subject to enforcement, but critically also enabling enforcement agents to carry out their duties with the full confidence that they were doing so in a fair and effective way. A referee on the pitch, if you like, to ensure that the important obligations which we know need to be met for creditors are met, while the people in the grip of a debt crisis are supported on a journey out. Now, I'm genuinely of the view that such a body could represent actually a once-in-a-generation reform with long-lasting and positive implications for social justice. But what would the body actually do? Well, there are three key dimensions which emerged in the report and in the proposal. Number one is about raising standards. The body would, like other regulators that we see, do everything in its power to drive innovation, but also to raise standards to the very highest level across the sector. It means things like reviewing the existing national standards, but also looking at new competencies and procedures and monitoring performance to make sure that it stays at that high level. Number two, improving accountability. It would fix the fragmented complaints process highlighted by the Justice Committee, but also better hold firms to account moving forward. And number three, it would ensure fair treatment and fair outcomes actually for all sides. It would develop new fair repayment and vulnerability protocols in wide consultation with the range of sectors involved, and we know just how many sectors are involved in this discussion. So finally then, just to touch on some next steps. I mean, since we published the report, the Taking Control for Good report in July last year, we've been, I think, really thrilled at the progress that's been made. We've gathered a huge amount of feedback and we've consulted very widely on the proposals across all the sectors involved. And just last week it was fantastic to see that the newly minted Enforcement Conduct Board has now appointed its chairperson, the excellent Catherine Brown, who's sat in our audience today. Welcome, Catherine. I know she's itching to meet lots of you in this room, which we're very pleased about. But we're also thrilled to be joined by Lord Wolfson, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Ministry of Justice. I'd like to say firstly thank you so much for being here, David, but also for all your support and your department's support in this initiative. And I'm going to invite the Minister up now to offer some reflections. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much indeed. This, as you see, is the modern red box. We've moved off to the traditional red box. Am I getting a loop? I don't know. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Well, look, let me say, first of all, how wonderful it is to be here at the Centre for Social Justice this morning, to be here physically, to have a physical event again, although hello to those watching on there's a Zoom-based pyjama party, as I understand it, to support the work that the CSJ has been doing, and obviously the Enforcement Oversight Working Group as well, and really to look forward to the launch of the Enforcement Conduct Board. So first let me say congratulations to Catherine. Really looking forward to working together. You bring a wealth of experience from other organisations and regulations of different sectors to the role, and I'm looking forward to working with you and the team you'll put together, and I'm sure that's going to be a very exciting time. I should also thank our hosts, not just the CSJ, but also Baroness Sally Morgan, who unfortunately can't be with us this morning, because they've done a huge amount of work in championing the idea of an independent oversight body. Thank you to you, Joe, for what you've just said, and I found that very helpful in distilling the issues which face the enforcement sector and where I think the board is going to be helpful in the future. Let me in particular thank the members of the working group. I don't want to turn this into an Oscars acceptance speech, but here goes. Representatives from CEDA, Civil Enforcement Association, Christians Against Poverty, Marston Holdings, Money Advice Trust, Step Change Debt Charity. There's a lot of work that's got into this, and there's a lot of work that's got us to where we are today. There will be a lot of work going forward as well over the next couple of years. I joined the MOJ about a year and a half ago. When I did, I had a vague understanding, frankly, of this whole area. But what was clear when I started to do some reading and receive some briefings is that we are standing on the shoulders of people who've been doing a lot of work in this area for some time. The debate about how enforcement agencies should operate has been going on really for some time. Back in 2014, my department introduced some significant reforms in the Tribunals, Courts and Enforcement Act, which regulate how enforcement agents enforce debt. And essentially they sought to strike a balance to provide protection for debtors who are being aggressively targeted, as they sometimes can be, while recognising that creditors do need to be able to recover debts which are properly due. We published our first review of those reforms in 2018, and I think the reforms found that the review found the reforms were having many positive benefits, but it was still clear that there was a constant reporting that some debtors were being aggressively targeted. So it was apparent that there were a number of creditors who simply weren't acting within the regulations. Obviously, we took that seriously. We held, as you heard from Joe, a call for evidence, and the idea of independent regulation and the need to improve the complaints process were issues which were raised by quite a number of respondents to that call for evidence. I should say that I think sometimes there's an idea that when a government has a call for evidence, it's really just going through the motions. And I think what this showed actually is that this call for evidence has actually led to a really positive outcome. So, next time you see a call for evidence, please give some evidence. Please do respond. And in July 2019, we said we wanted to explore further how we could encourage better industry self-regulation. Of course, as soon as you say July 2019, you immediately think, oh my God, COVID. And sure enough, COVID came along and that delayed our full response. But the fact is that representatives from the enforcement industry joined forces with the debt advice sector to establish the Enforcement Oversight Working Group. And I think that's another lesson actually we can take from the history of how we got to where we are today. That we actually got both, or should I say sides? Both sides of the debate, let's put it that way, both sides of the debate together. And I think that's actually a model in other areas as to how we can go forward. And that started a dialogue. So far as we're concerned in the MOJ and in government, we really want to work with what's been done by both sides of the industry. We think the future establishment of the Enforcement Conduct Board is a great step. It really has the potential to raise standards. And I'm grateful to the working group that they formulated the draft framework set out in the Taking Control for Good report, and the mandate which that sets out is focused on areas that we in government agree with. We want to see standards raised in collaboration with members to make new rules, improving the complaint system, the fair treatment of vulnerable people, supervising practice, and on improving accountability. And I'm very conscious that when I say that, I mean, that sounds like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, that sounds like, who would disagree with any of the items I've just set out. But the strength of what's been done is, as I say, that both sides of the debate have come together. That's why we in government are keen to see the board begin life as a voluntary body. We think that has the greatest chance of really changing the facts on the ground. It will bring enforcement agencies, the debt advice sector, creditors and policymakers together, and we'll see how it works in practice. If I can set out a few things which we think the focus could perhaps be on. First of all, what impact does the board have on creditors of different sizes? There's a huge difference if you're dealing with a large creditor with huge numbers of debtors or a small business with only a few creditors. Innovation, the way debt is created, transferred, packaged, rated, is changing all the time. That's going to be something which will need to be looked at. Standards will have to be consistent with existing best practice, and we also want to see how the board interacts with the well-established court-based certification process as well. We're very pleased that the Civil Enforcement Association has participated in the working group, and our hope is that all of its members, and indeed all civil enforcement firms who may not be members of Civia, will recognise that signing up to the board will be beneficial to them. We want essentially the market to show that being in this is where all firms should be. We are not going to walk away from this issue. It's simply too important to walk away from. As I've said, we do want it to start out as a voluntary body, but we've already committed to reviewing the operation of the board within 2 years of its establishment, and that's a commitment which I reiterate now. And let me be clear, if it's the case that we see that the board could benefit from legislative backing, then we will work with the board, the sector and other stakeholders to explore what statutory underpinning we can give to it. But we'll start off with a voluntary body. I'm very excited because I think actually this is a step change. It really has the potential to help debtors and I think also help enforcement firms. So thanks again to the CGS, to Baroness Morgan, to everybody here, to Joe, and I look forward in particular to working with you, Catherine, as we take this project forward to what I'm sure will be a really successful progression. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, David. And I've been looking at some sort of questions coming in from our online audience, which I pulled in. I hope we can spare some time for just a couple of those. So we've got one that came in from, I think it was from Ollie Smithson, who says, how can we be sure that the body targets what he describes as the rogue elements in the market on the edge of the sector? Are you confident that the Enforcement Conduct Board will reach those on the edge of the sector? How do we ensure that they sign up, essentially?
I think the short answer is that we believe that there will be powerful market incentives for firms to sign up to the board on a voluntary basis. I mean, it is a competitive industry out there. We think that the kite mark, if I can use that word, of being signed up will be something that firms want to do, and you know we want to make sure that really all firms are signed up and are within the body. But I do underline, you know, we are not walking away from this. We will review it within 2 years, and if we think at that time it needs statutory underpinning, then we'll discuss that.
Thank you. And another question. This is from Chris Decay. This one. He says, is the 2 year period a sort of a target? Is there any sense that could be shortened if you felt that the case for statutory underpinning was being made sort of sooner than then? What's the logic behind the 2 year period? Well,
the logic behind the 2 year period is that you've got to give a period. The one thing I've learnt in government is that when the minister says, we will keep a close eye on it, but doesn't give a date, nothing's happening. So you've got to give a date. You've got to have a sort of a sell-by date, but it's within 2 years. I mean, if it's clear well before 2 years that something needs to be done, we'll look at it then. But I think a 2 year period is long enough to get a good idea of how it's actually working in practice. So that's why I say within 2 years. But we will keep an eye on it. I mean, I'm sure I'll be in touch with Catherine and others, and the 2 years is to make sure that a review does take place. As I say, when ministers don't give a date, be suspicious.
Well, on that bombshell, David, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much
for being
indeed.
with us
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're very lucky now to have members of the working group and representatives involved to offer their reflections on the collaborative process that we've seen over the last couple of years, but also to to reflect on sort of what needs to happen next for this initiative to be a success. We're kind of, I suppose, it's like a punctuation point in between sort of two phases where the report published the proposal. We know that the board is on its way to being operationalised. And so I think this is almost a key inflection point for us to be thinking about what has happened and what needs to happen now. So to introduce our fantastic panel, a very warm welcome to the fire alarm. Thank you. There's no fire. Stay in your seat. We're all good. A very warm welcome to Carole Kenney. Carole is the serving president of the Civil Enforcement Association and the director of welfare and customer care at Cedar Group. Carole has over 20 years experience within the enforcement profession, has led a huge amount of work to improve outcomes for people in debt. Welcome, Carole. Next along is Peter Tutton. Peter's head of policy at Step Change Debt Charity, where he's been for 8 years. On top of, I know, an incredibly impressive career in policy and regulation. Welcome, Peter. Next, I'm also pleased to introduce Joanna Elson, Chief Executive of the Money Advice Trust. Joanna, you've been at the forefront of this conversation for several years now, and I know was awarded an OBE for services to people in debt in 2010, an accolade I'm very envious of, I must say. Welcome, Joanna. Next along, David Parkin. David is the Deputy Director for Civil Law Policy at the Ministry of Justice. Thank you for being with us, David, and for all of your work in this area. I know actually lots of your team will hopefully be watching the audience as well, and welcome to you too. And then finally, a very warm welcome to Gareth Hughes. Gareth is Chief Executive of Marston Holdings and really been the sort of industry leader kind of spearheading the reforms to enforcement in recent years. Very warm welcome to you, Gareth. And actually now a reminder to you, our audience here and also at home, you know, you've got a key role to play in this discussion. We want it to be an interactive discussion and debate, so please do stick your hand up when we come to the Q&A section shortly and pop a question in the Q&A box for those on Zoom at home. They will come to me via my phone. But without further delay, I'm going to turn to Carole for your opening remarks. Carole, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that welcome. And thank you to the Centre for Social Justice for their support in this initiative. I think it can be said that without Joe's leadership, challenge and diplomacy over the last 18 months, we probably wouldn't be sat here today with such a strong mandate for Catherine Brown to take forward into the establishment of this oversight body. In terms of reflections on this journey, it's quite interesting. We've talked about two very different sectors coming together for the greater good. But very early on, of course, discussion was around different policy views and sometimes spearing into the wider societal issues. But we did quite quickly come back to the role of enforcement and really discussing the important role that enforcement plays in society, from taxation compliance to the recovery of vital public funds and to that crucial support of the justice system. Looking at the private debt market and the public debt collection, and then drawing on comparisons perhaps between something similar like the Financial Conduct Authority and how that differs from what we really need for an enforcement oversight body. Particularly some of our principles around proportionality coming into play there when we consider that this market, of course, is likely to cover around 60 enforcement firms as opposed to the 50-odd thousand that the FCA has oversight for. So that's where a lot of our discussions focused on the niche of this sector and what oversight really needed to bring. With a strong focus on the conduct of enforcement agents and the firms that operate on behalf of local and central government. This was industry called for and is certainly welcomed across the Civil Enforcement Association and our members. We have really good support and this is ongoing So in terms of reach, I'm confident that we will see really good sign up in the initial phase of this body. What we realised in those early days is that we had more in common than we expected, and after we discussed the problems that the world faces, actually we all had the very same ambition, and that is to raise standards in this sector and ensure appropriate protection for vulnerable individuals. And that made the rest of the journey much easier, and we found that consensus was easily achieved around our principles and objectives. What I see in the next phase of this project is the establishment and a lot of hard work, which Catherine Brown I know will undertake successfully, to really establish the body and the independence of that body, and familiarisation with those independent individuals that will provide this oversight. For me, in terms of personal ambitions and what I would like to see in those early phases, I'd really like to see that market reach, and I think that can be achieved through, through market forces themselves, through mandating firms to be members of the Enforcement Conduct Board, through local authority procurement exercises. And I think a lot can be achieved even before statutory underpinning is looked at, through perhaps even small, straightforward changes to the certificated enforcement agent regulations to ensure that membership of the ECB is mandated through certification as well. And that would be a really strong way to get that reach that is so important. Complaints are crucial, and I think that will be an early day focus for the board. And for me personally, in terms of raising standards, we see a lot of good practice in our sector, and an increasing focus on protecting vulnerable individuals, and working very closely with our debt advice sector friends to ensure adequate support. I'd like to see in the next year or two that we're not talking about good practice or best practice in our sector, but that practice is standard and consistent across the board, and I really believe that can be achieved very early on in the formation of the Enforcement Conduct Board. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Carole, for those opening reflections. I'm going to turn to Peter now. Peter.
Thank you, Joe. Morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thank you, Joe and the CSA, for inviting me here. And as others have said, for your excellent work. CSJ's role has been central to this process. I'm not sure likening yourself to a referee is a good thing. I go to football quite often, and people don't always say nice things, but actually having Joe, having someone who kind of critical distance to both parties, moving the process along, and with the connections CSJ has into government, has been really important in moving along. So well done, CSJ, good work. We're not quite celebrating the birth of the ECB today, but that happy event will soon be with us. But one of the things we can do today is give a warm welcome to Catherine. Fantastic appointment as the first ECB chair. So I think that's one of the good things today. Chance for you to see some of the people in the sector, and chance for us to sort of celebrate that brilliant piece of progress that we're up and running. We have a chair. I suppose today we're also now putting to bed the Enforcement Oversight Working Group, really. We've done our job. Our job was to get the thing running, to establish a framework, and that framework has got us to this point. And I think I'll thank my co-members of that working group for coming together and kicking on. I think it's sort of debt advice, charities and the enforcement sector. To be honest, we've been knocking lumps out of each other for 20 years or more. And so getting together around the table was really a real victory for trust and for good faith, and colleagues from the enforcement sector deserve a lot of credit for that, for being willing to sit down and talk. And what that did is create a space for us to realise that we could talk about the things that we actually did agree on, which was the need for better oversight. And we're all clear that a strong, effective, independent oversight body for the enforcement firms and for enforcement officers is a great step forward. It's also a pretty good return for all the work done by my colleagues in the Taking Control campaign. So we are a coalition of, how many charities are we a coalition of now, colleagues? 13 charities who've been working, I think since possibly 2017, campaigning for reform. So I think our key ask was for independent oversight. So I think this is a good return. Actually, our call was for independent statutory oversight, and we still think we still want to see that statutory underpinning. We think it's necessary. So we're very glad that the Minister has said today that that option is still on the table and under review. I think my main message today is, for now, what is really important is that the ECB gets all the support it needs to deliver that strong, effective, independent oversight. It needs to know that its legitimacy and authority is recognised right across government, right across, particularly with public sector creditors. Not just from the Ministry of Justice, though the Minister's comments today are excellent in reaffirming the Ministry's commitment to this, and David being with us as well today. So that's really good to see that commitment is there for the Ministry of Justice. But ECB is going to need wider support. Each and every public sector body that uses enforcement by taking control of goods in its debt recovery practice needs to be demonstrating its support for the ECB. The working group, I think the thing we can be most proud of in the working group is that we gave the ECB a strong mandate, and I quote, a mandate to ensure fair treatment and appropriate protection for people subject to enforcement, with particular regard to the need to protect people in financial difficulty or other vulnerable circumstances. Now, many people in this room will understand the need to improve the way that debt recovery works, and particularly with public sector creditors, how in that process of recovery, the needs of people in financial difficulty and vulnerability are dealt with. More broadly across government, there are important initiatives underway to address this. We've seen fairness principles and work from the Cabinet Office. We see a social value framework being developed by the Crown Commercial Service, which also touches on enforcement. And we see good examples, good practice examples from parts of central government and local government. So ECB is coming into a landscape where there's good stuff out there, but it's patchy and it's not yet tied together. So really one of the things with all these kind of initiatives that are out there, one of the things I hope that we should be able to manage progress in initiatives to improve the way that financial difficulty and vulnerability is dealt with is actually by how deeply the principles set out in the ECB's mandate is accepted and embedded into the everyday practices of creditors as well as enforcement agents and enforcement agent firms in every government department, in every local authority's collection team. Last week I did some focus group sessions with a small group of step change clients, and they all talked powerfully about the very dark place that their financial difficulties had taken them to. They also talked about their worries about the fierce financial pressures that many households are going to experience in the months ahead. This is really why we're here today. The successful ECB represents a break from past approaches to debt that have been really too tolerant to harm. And the ECB points towards a better, fairer way of dealing with debt. For those reasons, we must give it all the help it needs to deliver on its mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your kind words as well. I'm going to turn to Gareth next.
Thanks, Joe. In April 2020, the CSJ's Collecting Dust report rightly highlighted the sensitivity of the enforcement process. And that sensitivity, of course, was compounded by the onset of and the implications of the coronavirus pandemic. I was also acutely conscious that the warrant recovery process itself was still poorly understood by the general public, and that could make people in debt unduly afraid of reaching out and explaining their circumstances. As an industry, we needed to do more to communicate and explain that process. Furthermore, the lack of independent oversight of the sector impacted its credibility. It was clear that independent oversight was needed, not only to call out examples of poor practice, but also to spotlight the good. In talking with Taking Control campaign representatives at the outset, the industry agreed two things. Firstly, a public commitment to raising standards, not just to maintaining them. And secondly, that the industry would underwrite the cost of the independent body. With these two important principles established, the framework discussions were collaborative and constructive. And from that work came an outline of a draft framework that the Enforcement Conduct Board itself can develop, iterate and evolve when it's fully up and running. I was delighted to learn of Catherine's appointment late last month, and we will give you all the support and cooperation you need to make this work, make your work a success. Also, Sam Younger from our advisory group at Marston is here today, and I know that Sam and the advisory group are similarly keen to share their learnings from the 9 years of its operation. I'd really like to thank again Joe and the CSJ team for listening to the points that we made and for chairing those discussions between the advice sector and the industry that has enabled this groundbreaking initiative to come into being. I would also like to thank Lord Wolfson and the Ministry of Justice for listening and understanding to the collaboration and supporting that collaboration between the advice sector and the industry, and that's allowing us to bring about real change as we move forward. I'd like to thank also the Taking Control campaign members for being willing to collaborate on this groundbreaking initiative. And as an industry, we are absolutely committed to maintaining the strength and depth of that collaboration as we move forward. We do support the need for statutory underpinning of the Enforcement Conduct Board, and I was again grateful to the Ministry of Justice for its commitment to review the need for that statutory underpinning within 2 years of the board's formation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've been going through my notes, crossing out the things that everyone said, so hopefully you won't hear things twice. By the time we get to you, David, you'll have nothing left to say, but you know, there we go. So to add my tribute, Joe, to you and the team here for helping to broker this important work, and to the working group who have really gone the extra mile. I think, you know, if I had asked you 5 years ago even, whether we would be sitting in this room, standing some of us in this room, together, having made the agreement, the framework agreement that's been made and about to launch a new body, I don't think any of us would have believed that. So that is a real tribute to everybody in this room and of course beyond. I want to say, and this is not in my notes, a big thank you to Matt Hartley at the back there, who is the Money Advice Trust, so the charity I run, our representative on that group, and I turn up at these events and take the glory, but Matt does the hard work and puts the hard yards in and is well respected for it, I know. So just a few reflections, if I may. Our wider strategy as a sector has been about reduce and reform, so simultaneously campaigning to reduce the number of council tax and other debts being referred for enforcement in the first place, and reform of bailiff action itself to better protect, of course, those who are subject to it. And I think the establishment of the Enforcement Conduct Board is a mark of real progress on the reform side of that ledger. Like others, I was really pleased to hear the Minister's support for the new body, and in strong terms, and also his reiteration of a commitment to review statutory underpinning, because that will be important. We continue to believe that a statutory basis for the board's standards and sanctions is the real tangible step that the government can take to support this work. We've all agreed that Catherine is a great appointment, and I can say, as somebody who was on the board appointing her, that she was the outstanding candidate of a very professional and significant field. So I think we are all very lucky to have had that kind of interest and to have Catherine in this role, and I know that we will all personally be working hard to make it work. And whoever it was you, Pete, wasn't it, who said about the referee? My 16-year-old daughter is an FA referee, and it's hard work being a referee. You get abuse from all sides and you have to stand your ground. We will be behind you, hopefully not too far behind you, helping you stand your ground, whoever is taking you on, as it were. So just finally, what does success look like? Because I think lots of people will be interested in that. So my answer is the test, as always, will be on the front line, because for us in the debt advice sector, that means whether debt advisors are able to see a reduction in the harm that our advisors see and hear about on a daily basis. It's important also to recognise, you know, we're friends in this room, that there's scepticism out there as well. I'm sure there's scepticism on your side, Gareth, and on Carole yours and the scepticism on ours as well. And part of our job is to bring people with us on that journey. And my feeling from the conversations I've had is that the vast majority of stakeholders are with us, and that there's a moment here, a window where we can make something work together, and to help the board, the new board, to show it's prepared to use its sanctions where that's appropriate, and to play a positive, proactive role in developing the standards that will raise practice across the sector as Gareth has set out. So that's why I'm so pleased that we're all here today. And maybe just on one final note, we mustn't forget the other side of the reduce and reform agenda. Reducing the number of debts that reach enforcement agents in the first place will only become more important in the light of the cost of living crisis we are all seeing very tangibly out there at the moment. I think the ECB could play an important advocacy role. We stand ready to help you do that. That's enough from me, I think. Thank you very much indeed, Joe.
Brilliant, thank you, Joanna. And then I see David sort of scribbling, crossing out more and more and more, but hopefully there's something left to say. David, over to you.
Joe. First of all, reflecting on Lord Wolfson's candid comment that you should always get a target for your reviews from government, I'm not looking forward to going back to us finding a whole host of emails from angry stakeholders to whom I've said, don't worry, we're on it, we'll get back to you in due course. Just reflecting on some of the comments we've heard this morning, and first of all, I think we first discussed the idea of a enforcement conduct body, Joe, back in 2020 at the height of COVID, when my activity and my energy and that of MOJ was largely in stopping enforcement because of the public health risks of COVID. It seems slightly in real time now, and it seemed slightly ambitious then to be discussing the creation of a enforcement body like this, and it is a testimony to the efforts of Joe personally and the CSJ and all the people involved in the working group to bring us together today. So thank you from behalf of MOJ, when our energy, frankly, and our energy for quite some time has been not positively taking forward the enforcement agenda and just dealing with the essential COVID effects on enforcement. I also add my thanks to Lord Wolfson, to Catherine for her arrival, and I look forward to working with you over the next few years on this body. And I just want to pick up one or 2 points mentioned by my fellow panellists this morning. Carole mentioned differing policy views and consensus, and I think that's something that's absolutely critical for this group, this new board. It has been difficult, I think, in the past for government to sift through and contend with a whole range of conflicting viewpoints on enforcement. I don't expect those to disappear, and it's quite right that sectors continue to represent their interests as best they can. But this new group gives us a body which provides, I hope, a degree of consensus with which we can work over the next few years, and I wouldn't underestimate how important that is. Secondly, we talk quite a bit about market forces and getting as much coverage of people as possible. And I think that is absolutely right. And the role that government can play in that, I will happily explore both with you and my colleagues across government. And I think it's almost taken up, it's not just market forces, it's a level above that. If the ECB can define standards, if it can create an identity for what is a modern, humane enforcement industry, the question for people in it must be, why aren't you signed up? What's stopping you? And then you will be, in a sense, on the outside if you do not feel that you can be part of this group. And I think that's quite important. We will play a role in that. Peter mentioned the need for a strong independent oversight body, and Lord Wolfson has articulated that we see this as a voluntary body, but we have given that commitment to review. And I think part of the next 2 years is giving this body time to make a success of itself, but constantly talk to you about how it's going, where you think you may need stronger push from government, where we can help you in a variety of ways. And we're certainly ready ready to do that. And Peter also mentioned legitimacy and authority, and I see the role of MOJ to be a flag waver for the ECB, both within government and also our partners in local government and elsewhere. And if we can represent your interests and act as that sort of coalescing body to bring parts of government together for your benefit and ultimately for customers' benefit, then we will certainly do so. So, and I thank you, Joanna, for articulating success factors. I entirely agree with those. And what MOJ want to do is to work with you as strongly as possible over the next few years to make a success of it. So I welcome it. It, in a sense, creates a slightly harder job for me, but I absolutely welcome that too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks to all of our panel for those opening remarks. Now, we've had a flurry of questions coming in from our online audience. Do keep those coming in. But our physical audience have been sitting very patiently. I'd like to introduce them to the discussion now. So I'm going to take a show of hands for anyone who'd like to ask a question of the panel. Would anyone like to ask a question, or shall we jump straight into our online? Yes, a microphone will come to you imminently.
Thanks. Sam Younger, I chair the Independent Advisory Group for Marston. And I suppose it is a question thinking about the 2-year period to establish itself, is what the ECB and indeed the industry and or the advice sector can do to try to pull in those people who may be reluctant to sign up. I mean, I think we can be very optimistic at the moment about the bona fides and the commitment of everybody in this room and represented in this room. But as somebody said right at the beginning, a lot of the animus against the sector comes from the rogue operators. And it seems to me we need to do something very active to reach out to those people, not just to say market forces will get them either out of the game or compliant. And I just wonder, what can be done proactively to try to pull in those elements that are not currently participating and not currently committed.
I'm going to let Carole take that one first, and then Joanna after.
Thank you, Sam, for that question. It's really important. In terms of the Civil Enforcement Association, our membership accounts for over 95% of the civil enforcement industry. Civia have already committed to mandating membership of the Enforcement Conduct Board within our association rules, and that rule change will go through at our next AGM on the 5th of May. So I'm confident that the full Civia membership will come on board. In terms of the smaller organisations that perhaps aren't Civia members and perhaps unfairly get criticised as being the rogues of the industry, are probably smaller firms and quite often owner-led firms. And those owner-led firms are normally certificated enforcement agents that are leading, those operations. And as I said, I think there is a conversation to be had down the line with the Ministry of Justice just to look at the requirements under the certification rules for mandating membership of individuals. And I think that would give almost 100% reach of the Civil Enforcement Association.
Well, just to add a question, Sam, just to add that David very kindly made an offer about bringing different parts of government together. Obviously, one of the big areas that we need to make progress in here is with local authorities, and I think we want to get to the place where firms shouldn't be winning contracts if they're not ECB authorised. And I think if we work together on that basis, well before we get to the 2 years, we should be in that place.
Any other questions from our audience? I'm looking for hands. Okay, I'm going to take one from our online audience, which is asking about, we've spoken a lot about civil enforcement today, but there's also the High Court sector, which is a very important sector. This question comes in which says, when are we expecting the High Court enforcement sector to be covered by this, and is that an ambition involved in this initiative?
Well, I'm an authorised High Court enforcement officer as well, and I know that and David is here from the association. I know there's already a number of discussions that have taken place with the High Court Enforcement Officers Association and the prototype working group, and I expect that collaboration to continue. And with Catherine's appointments, I would hope and expect that more and more organisations will want to join it as it takes off.
And a question now from Teresa Perchard, who asks, will the ECB have sufficient resources, that's people and cash, to deliver the step change that the Minister, I think she's alluding to there, said, but particularly in audit? An interesting question there. So a question of resourcing the ECB. Will it have the oomph to do all the ambitious things that we've proposed that it will do?
Well, I mean, from the sector, the best place to answer that. I mean, the answer is it needs it. There is a ingredients list of effective regulation that I think, you know, we know enough about regulation to know what's needed to work. So an organisation, it has to have a viable level of resource in order to be able to do the things to provide that effective oversight. Now, what that is in cost terms remains to be seen, and I think that's one of the next stage of the negotiations. But colleagues from the enforcement sector are best place to talk about that.
Absolutely. Throughout this journey and through Civia, we have actively engaged with all of our members in terms of the funding of this organisation, and as I said, we have the full support of our Civia Executive Council in terms of this being funded by the industry, and in terms of the initial, of course, start-up and supporting and ensuring that Catherine has those resources. So that has been underwritten by the Civil Enforcement Association, and going forward, of course, Catherine will develop exactly what sort of resources and budget is required. But as I said, the industry are supportive, and that funding will be available.
Oversight has a cost, compliance has a cost, raising standards has a cost, but that cost isn't optional. This is essential. And when we spoke, Catherine, I endorsed what Carole said on behalf of Civia, that you will get the funding that you need to make this body the success that it needs to be.
Some more questions coming in from our online audience. Do keep those coming in, those at home or in the office. We got a question from Kevin Shaw, who asks, will the ECB have a remit to influence creditors to reduce what he describes as overzealous use of enforcement powers? Something we've touched on a little bit, but it'd be good to just sort of explore that a bit more, the scope of the ECB to shape the wider discussion about debt management, you might say, than purely the reform aspect. I mean, David, from your perspective, you know, we've spoken a bit about how we bring different government departments together on this discussion. That seems a way that the ECB might be able to galvanise the discussion. What's your sense of its role there?
I think that's probably true. Now, creditors deserve effective enforcement of money owed to them. Without that, they will themselves quickly, some of them fall into debt themselves, and some of their financial position is quite precarious. So, but I think if there are conversations long-term with creditors, major creditors, about a different model of enforcement potentially, with less use and regard for certain sorts of enforcement, and if we can be part of that conversation in MOJ and involve the ECB in that conversation with creditors, we would happily have a part in facilitating that too.
And Joanna, I know this was something that you touched on, your remarks, that sort of wider role. I mean, how do you see that taking shape materially?
Yeah, I mean, I think that will be for the board to shape how it wants to play in that other aspect of the important work that we've done together. So I don't want to give Catherine too difficult a job to do in her first few days and weeks. But I do think there's an advocacy role that Catherine and the board and all of us can play as we are talking to creditors about what's appropriate. And I just remind people that we are going to be going through a particularly difficult period in the next while. You know, if it wasn't for the horrific things that are happening in Ukraine, I think there would be more focus on the exponential rise of the cost of living at the moment, the increase in bills, in energy costs, in fuel, the national insurance rise, and so on and so on. And that is going to create a very difficult situation for people, many of whom are already teetering on the edge. And so appropriate and responsible enforcement by creditors is going to be absolutely key. And it's all of our jobs to work towards that.
Okay. The Cabinet Office call for evidence. We looked at our data on government and local government debt, and we looked at council tax debt. And one of the things we found that step change clients with council tax debt, actually those that had additional vulnerabilities were more likely for their debt to be with a bailiff firm than those that were not vulnerable. So that suggests to us that kind of local governments are not necessarily that good in assessing things like vulnerability and affordability before it goes to the bailiffs. So it washes up with these guys to kind of do those assessments. So kind of the answer to that question is absolutely. I think it's a very key part, or it should be, in my view, a key part of the ECB's role to work with creditors. So when we're talking about setting standards for the enforcement sector, I don't think we're just talking about rogues and individual practice. Actually, it's about setting the terms in which enforcement happens. So yes, we need effective enforcement, but we also need that mandate, which is about protection with people in financial difficulty and protection people in vulnerabilities. And understanding, for creditors to understand that what you get if you use an enforcement officer and what you get if you go to enforcement and what you should think about before you do that is actually a key part of raising standards in the sector. It's in no one's interests to pursue people who are skint and vulnerable through taking control of goods. So I think it's a yes, but I think it's also a must. And one of the things that we, as the debt advice sector, will do to stand behind the ECB is be making that argument about what good practice looks like. But also the message we've heard from other sectors, from the debt collection sector in consumer credit, who say that when regulation hit them, the FCA, which they were all very nervous about, but they improved their practices, actually it didn't affect their collection rates. They changed their mindset, they thought about affordability. It's still possible to have effective collection enforcement, but in a fair debt collection framework.
Yeah, I completely agree with your final points there, Peter. It's quite interesting. The questions come from Kevin Shaw, who I've worked with quite closely over the last few years through Cedar Group, really promoting good practice, referrals through to debt advice sector, through their money advisor network. And actually, I know Kevin's very active promoting that good practice through local authorities. And actually, we've seen a significant change just in the last 12 months in terms of how local authorities are using enforcement agents. And I think that's a positive impact of the COVID pandemic. You know, there's a lot more engagement with the third sector. There is a lot more review of cases before passing them through to enforcement. We're seeing that now just over the last 12 months. I think, as we echoed earlier, if there's, good standard setting through the ECB, why would enforcement agents not want to be part of that? And that will have a positive influence on the creditors that use enforcement agents. So we won't just be talking about those one or two local authorities that are really embracing change in how they deal with vulnerable individuals. But again, it will be standard across the board. And that's what we're looking for. Consistency from creditors, consistency within enforcement practices.
Thanks, Carole. So I think just kind of moving the discussion to some of the challenges involved. I mean, we talked about a lot of the positives and the things that we think can come out of this and the real potential it has. But I think it would be helpful to touch on what we see as the main challenges, because I think there are some big challenges involved here, and perhaps also to think about how we overcome some of those. So I don't know who'd like to take that one up first, who's going to be brave and look to some of the challenges here. But it seems to me like that's a key discussion that needs to be had, as well as the positives involved. Carole, do you want to dive in?
I think one of the key challenges is perhaps when we start to look at affordable repayments. I think it's something that debt advice sector feel very strongly about. Peter there has touched upon, actually, when the FCA have put in certain practices in terms of affordable repayment, it hasn't negatively impacted collections. And that's been my experience through Cedar Group, that actually you can manage, you can review affordability in a consistent way. But I think, you know, that's quite... It's a challenge in terms of ensuring we're fair to the creditor as well, in terms of collecting that money. And I think that's where the discussion, you know, broaches the main challenges. And of course, there's different debt types. So if we're looking at collection of council tax, it is more sensitive, and we really understand that there is poverty. There are people genuinely can't afford to pay their council tax, and the development of reviewing affordability and sustainable repayment plans is really important for those people. Whereas if we look at other areas of enforcement, such as the collection of criminal, you know, magistrates' fines, there needs to be a really robust, effective enforcement process, and affordability has already been assessed at the earlier stage. So I think there's challenges in terms of just understanding the different nuances, and actually, you know, perhaps a slightly different approach when looking at different debt types as well.
Any other thoughts on challenges, Peter?
I agree with that. Obviously, there's going to be pressures. So some of the main, as it were, clients of the enforcement sector is local government. Pressure on local government is going to intensify over the next couple of years, I would have thought. We've certainly been seeing council tax arrears rates amongst our clients going up. Before pandemic, through pandemic, and I'm sure they will rock up now. So it's when people are under sort of pressure, you know. So that's one of the things the ECB, you know, the ECB is born at a time of, it's not an easy time. So there will be resistance, and again, that's where support from government came in. We would have hoped to have seen more than we did from the then MHCLG, now LUHC review of council tax enforcement, which provided some more guidance. But you can paper this room in guidance on. So that's one of the challenges. I think there is a challenge about fixing outcomes and agreed outcomes, and how to move those on, and how they might be nuanced. As Carole says. There's going to be a challenge on evidence as ever, and how to demonstrate. I mean, it'll be important to kind of be in a position for the ECB to be able to tell a story about what is changing, and we will all have to think about how we help that to happen, to show that all this work is actually delivering differences on the ground.
Thank you. Joanna?
Well, just to add one, and I hope we're not scaring you off, Catherine, as we come up with this long list of challenges. I guess the other one for me is getting the sanctions regime right, and that will be a challenging and difficult job, but it needs to be done. You know, we've set out, we've agreed that sanctions need to be based on a tariff. We're escalating with the severity of non-compliance. There'll be, so the ECB will be developing that regime after consultation. Again, I guess my message to everyone is we all need to play our part in that. We've come together because we want to make this work, and we have to be realistic. We have to do just as the working group has done, is put ourselves in the other people's shoes and hear both sides, and then we will get, I'm sure, an effective and proportionate sanctions regime that will do what we all want to do, which is raise standards.
Yeah, well, I was going to agree with that. In a sense, we've got to the easy part. The hard work of actually making progress and maintaining the consensus and unity here today comes over the next few years, and anything MOJ can do to help keep that together, we will do. Another challenge is also, there will be times when I think the ECB will disagree with government, almost certainly, and keeping our good relations and keeping our positivity going will be important. And one of those areas will no doubt be the statutory underpinning. It won't surprise you to know that the statutory timetable is extremely squeezed over the next few years, but it's something that we're willing to look at. So there will be difficulties and some fallouts, but I'm sure we can keep our positivity together.
And if, you know, Catherine is able to create a very easy to introduce, sort of seamless bit of secondary legislation that might provide the statutory underpinning the body needs, would that be something that...
Music to my ears, yes.
Okay, that's something to take away. Any final thoughts from Gareth on the challenges involved before we take a question from the audience?
I just think we all should not collectively underestimate the challenges of changing the public perception of enforcement. You know, it's been rightly criticised, I would say, over the last 20 years at times, and examples of poor practice have been called out in the media. But examples of good practice, the fact that 50% of all liability orders that have gone to, in old words, bailiff activity, are actually settled by compliance activity, payment arrangements, and all the things that we are investing to do more of. But notwithstanding that, changing the media narrative related to the enforcement process, I think, will remain a challenge over the next few years.
We're going to take a question from the audience now, the gentleman at the front here.
Thank you very much. My name's Martin. I do the same job in Cedar as Sam does in Marston's, and I'm conscious as we've been discussing the challenges here that the challenges are getting worse. Indeed, the challenges have been getting much worse since you were appointed, Catherine. I reflected, yes. Serious. I'm serious. I reflected yesterday. I think in imperial measures, I paid £8 a gallon for diesel on the M1 yesterday. At the same time, I chair a charity in the northeast of England, and I know how impoverished some local authorities are and how desperately they need council tax income to preserve not edges on luxury services, but children's services and care for the elderly. But here's a challenge which I think is doable, and Joanna, you mentioned it early in your time. As I delve into complaints at Cedar and look at the cases that come to court and monitor videos from body-worn cameras, I see lots of people who've gotten into trouble with council tax, and to some extent you can understand that. But I also see a significant proportion of people, usually mums, without a man in their life taking financial or emotional responsibility, who get a tiny debt for crossing the Dartford crossing or for a parking debt, and they leave it and they don't open the mail, and eventually they owe hundreds of pounds and they're hugely distressed by that experience and they can't afford it. We could do something about that. It wouldn't just be the charities in this room. It would require other charities, including the one I used to lead, which was Bernardo's, to try to convince people in the very early stages of debt that ignoring it is going to make their lives much, much worse. If we could do something on that, then actually the number of cases that come through for enforcement could fall quite significantly.
On that question there, Peter.
I'll try and say a bit. I mean, it's a really good point. One of the things we think about a lot is how to get people to help earlier with debt, to help with their debt earlier. We know that when people come to us, and half of people who come to us, I'm sure it's the same for MAT, have been worrying about their debts for a year or more, and that's when the real harm grows. The debts grow, the stress grows. You know, it becomes very, very harmful. So there's a real value in getting people to get to help earlier. But it's actually quite hard, and we've a couple of bits of work, thing we're working on now, thing we put out a couple of weeks ago, shows that people don't like to ask for help for various different reasons, because they don't know what the payoffs are. They don't know if you go into, you know, with various different debts, if you go into the creditor and ask for help, will they be nice to you? Will they be nasty to you? What's the payout? Will it affect your credit rating? All these kind of things. Also, people kind of try to manage things by themselves. So that kind of not engaging, if people not engage, well, then they juggle and then they borrow. So sometimes people use strategies to try and manage their financial difficulty, which get them through next week but make the problem worse in the long term. And again, talking to some of our clients in focus groups last week, you know, when they get stuff that says pay this, but they don't have the means to pay it, they all talked about having a drawer that the letters just go into. So it's when you're faced with the impossible, one of the ways to cope with that is to ignore it. So you raised that's the $1 million question really, and kind of how do we get people to engage in financial difficulty earlier? The answer to it, I think, is quite complicated. People behave in complicated ways, and a whole bunch of creditors need to be better at spotting difficulties earlier, but also things that understanding people's circumstances and how they behave. So if you ramp fines up and make them more expensive and send people letters saying you have to pay this all at once, they're going to put it in the drawer. They're not going to engage. It's a really good question.
Absolutely agree with all that. It's a great point. And just to add that when people do make the brave step of phoning a creditor or indeed a debt advice agent they need to be then talking to people who are well trained, who are empathetic, and who can help them onto the next stage. Because all too often we hear that they have made that brave call, they open the letter, and then they're in a queue for half an hour, or the person on the phone doesn't understand the severity or quite what it means to them. I think there's a lot we can do together to make sure that everybody on the front line, whether they're in a creditor, an enforcement agency, or in our services, you know, are as empathetic, as client-focused, and as positive as they can be, because I think that will help for those people who do take that brave step of opening the letter and picking up the phone.
Yeah, yeah, I was just going to say very briefly, it's not my part of the world and it's not MOJ's part of the world, but I know a lot is going on across government to help people in problem debt, from the almost £100 million funding for the Money and Pension Service, to the implementation of breathing space last year, to the proposed implementation of the statutory debt repayment scheme. So quite a lot is going on. I'm sure, I know the people involved in this, the analysis there about the potential for increased debt as a result of COVID, and it will be a challenge for government to see how that works, their proposals, and what else might be needed.
So we've looked a little bit about we've sort of looked back on the process of coming together as a working group. We've touched on the challenges involved, but I think it would be helpful to end really by looking forward a bit and thinking about what does success look like. And I know the speakers have touched on this a little already in their remarks, but I'd like to just run through and, you know, maybe just offering the key thing that you see as the ingredient for success that you'd prioritise. I'm going to go from right to left, I think, if that's okay, to round us off in this discussion. Carole, what do you see as the sort of key, you know, what's the key vision for success?
The key vision for success, I guess, is exactly what we've been talking about today, but to sum it up would be that the ECB is recognised across the enforcement industry and does have that that all-encompassing reach. Hopefully before you come to your review of statutory underpinning, I think that can be achieved. And, you know, that there is a measurable way to show that those standards have raised through, you know, through facts and figures from the debt advice side, and through, you know, the independent, you know, annual reports that we will see from the ECB going forward.
Thank you, Carole. Peter?
What Carole said, really. Only have to say, I mean, I've been looking at these issues for 18 odd years, so never having to talk about it again would be a great thing. But and also, maybe in a short term, in 2 years' time, if we came back here, if we're all saying ECB doing a bloody good job, that would be great. That would be a great success outcome.
Joanna?
Well, to echo that, and just to add one thing really, I mean, I could have come today, as could Peter, with lots of horror stories, and today is not the day for that. But we do get horror stories across our desk. You do, I do, Matt does, Gareth does, lots of others do. Let's, you know, we don't want to be seeing those horror stories. In 2 years' time, if it's a kind of negative answer, but if we're not getting those, let's chalk that up as a significant success. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I would add on a personal level, a measure of success for me is that I can wind up the enforcement policy team in MOJ one day.
They might be listening into this.
They will be looked after.
I'm sure there's other things they could be usefully doing.
And Gareth, round us up.
I think the final point, which echoes it, comments Joanna and everybody's made, is improved public confidence in the warrant recovery process and better understanding of what that process actually entails, all the way through from early stage compliance through to latter stage field recovery.
Thank you all. And Catherine, it sounds like you've got a long menu there of things to choose from just to get started with. And I'm going to close by saying a huge thank you to our panel. I'd like to just give a quick round of applause for their discussion there. We'll say thank you, of course, to Lord Wolfson and David for being with us. We're hugely appreciative of their time and commitment to this initiative. And a final thank you to our audience, both in person and at home. You've been great. Thanks very much for being with us.